have two talks on the topic of culture driving demand, steps towards a sustainable Pacific Rim. Our discussant for this section is Salmeen here from the University of Michigan. Worked for many years in the automotive industry for Ford. Then, very fittingly, he worked here for a long time in our complex systems group, and I think you'd all agree this is a complex system. Starting this summer, he'll be in a new appointment here at Michigan in the Ford School for Public Policy. Irv.
I have about 3 minutes of introductory remarks to help set the stage and the motivations for this session. Really, the purpose of the session is to ask the broad question. And the broad question is to try to say, what is the cultural meaning? What does it mean to people on a daily scale what sustainability and energy is about? I'm a physicist by training, and for us, physics point of view is that energy is an abstraction. It really came into prominence roughly 1800, so it's a young idea, but it really is the framing for a lot of the ways in which we think about things. If you look at the history throughout the 20th century especially, the idea of energy in sort of folk language, it's morphed into originally oil, and now it's morphing into greenhouse gases. But the current context for it largely is consumer-oriented, essentially commodity goods. For a lot of reasons, of course, obviously, fossil fuels in particular are extremely useful, and they have undesirable consequences. And so the question to us as a physics community, engineering community is, well, let's stop using that, let's use something else. And so we hear a lot about, of course, sun, wind power. And if you have a background in physics and engineering, one of the first questions you ask is, okay, let's do some numbers. And when you do the numbers, there's a very unpleasant truth that comes out. Looking off into the future, there's a huge gap between what we're capable of getting out of solar, wind, so-called alternatives, and what projections of future demand are. And so a question that comes up to us is, what if we can't get there from here? What do we do? And so we begin to think at the problem sort of in the following way. Think of it as a problem not how big is the coal pile, but how fast do we use it? And how fast we do something is a question of personal choices, people's choices, cultural choices. And so the question then arises, well, what do we understand about what it is that people do and why they do it? Just as the word energy is a physicist's abstraction for thinking about a lot of these things, in many respects, culture is a social scientist's abstraction about how you think about people. And so the question then arises is, well, what do we know about the cultural context of energy and sustainability questions? And so that's the question posed before today. And essentially the idea is that the way in which, for example, the US may approach some of the future issues of closing the gap may be along a very different course, for example, from what China chooses because of these cultural questions. And the real issue is, what do we understand about it? The old American saying that sometimes you can take a horse to the trough of water, but you can't make her drink, is a sense of this understanding that even if we do, what are the behavioral aspects that lead to uses? To illustrate this cultural question, I'd just like a show of hands. How many of you know the book Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold? Okay, a few of you know this. This is one of the widely, written in 1948, it really is one of the widely used texts in books in the U.S. educational system to try to convey a sense of the cultural meaning and the cultural ethics of nature. Roughly in 1988, there was a Chinese scholar, Wen Hui Hao, and I apologize if I'm mutilating the pronunciation in Chinese. who visited the University of Missouri. The University of Missouri at that time, and I think it still is a center of study for the history of the environmental movement. And she was exposed to the Sand County Almanac and decided to translate it into Chinese. About 1992 or so, the translation was available and published. In about a month, 3,000 copies were sold. By 1998, a full Chinese version was published and is now, I've read, widely used in Chinese primary secondary education to try to capture some of these cultural aspects of the meaning of environment, meaning of nature. But the point is the following. We're talking about cultural interpretations of energy and sustainability. And one of the questions that she rose in trying to translate this book is Aldo Leopold relied heavily on metaphor to try to translate the meaning of a lot of these ideas into sort of stories that resonated within the English word. So she struggled with, just to illustrate 3 points, what does it mean in Chinese to say a bird wears its heart on its sleeve? In English, the cultural meaning of that interpretation is pretty clear, but how do you transport that into Chinese? What does it mean to think like a mountain? Or alternatively, the trees speak to us through the wind. And eventually she was apparently successful in translating this into meaningful Chinese from English. But in many respects, the question that's being asked here is how do you translate what we see as the cultural meaning of energy, technology, sustainability into these two cultures? So the first speaker this morning is Professor David Nye, who's written widely on cultural aspects of technology, but in particular the grounding for this talk and sort of the connection is he's written probably the most comprehensive, broadly cultural survey of energy in a book entitled Consuming Power, A Social History of American Energies. Our second speaker is Professor Yaxing Wang from MIT, who's an economist. But I've got to say, in the sense that the physicist sees energy as an organizing principle, the culture concepts see this as an organizing principle for people and behaviors, the economist's version is sort of the way a physicist would look at culture. And so, since that's such a driving part of a lot of these questions, integrating these cultural questions into these broader economic perspectives sort of is the aim. So I'll turn the podium over to Professor Nye, and then we'll follow that with talk by Professor Wang. And I guess we'll harvest questions, and we'll see how the time works out. So, David.